In the 2013 Women's World Cup, England was seen as the favourite in their group. India had some stars, but weren't seen as that strong a side, and the West Indies would make a more significant impact in that tournament than we probably thought at the start. Sri Lanka were the fourth team in that group. At that point, the English women weren't quite professional, but they were very, very close. And they certainly had an extraordinary team. Lydia Greenway, Heather Knight, Jenny Gunn, and Catherine Brunt were in that lineup. Oh, and their captain was Charlotte Edwards. The Sri Lankans were amateurs with no real hope of becoming professional cricketers, and they'd played only 94 ODIs in their entire history. They averaged 17 runs per wicket in those, scoring at 3.26 runs and over. And the highest score ever in an ODI was only 251 at that point. England were also the reigning World Cup winners, and they set them 239 to win. Not a huge total, but certainly enough to defend if you're the world champions going up against a team who's barely ever scored that many runs.
This is the last knot. My dad told me to say this.
Instead, Chamari Adipatu took them on, and when she was out, Sri Lanka was 101 in the 24th over. That was the highest score in her career outside of 100 against Ireland at that point. In the years to come, Adipatu would flourish, including the third highest score in women's ODIs. But after that incredible stand, Sri Lanka actually lost regular wickets. But then came in Ishani Lokusu, and the score at that point was 153 for 4. And it's worth looking at her history because in her first 12 matches, she never actually broke a score of 10. And despite being a very experienced player at this point, she'd only made one career 50 at that stage. In fact, her last 6 ODI knocks coming into that innings were 3, 2 not out, 1, 1, duck, and 25. And not long after she got to the crease, she lost her partner as well, meaning they were now 5 down. And even Loku Saria Gay wouldn't quite make it to the end of the innings, but she got pretty close. She was dismissed off the third last ball, run out when there just wasn't really one there, when the scores were tied. Before that, she made 56 from 41, and she was smoking them. There were 3 sixes in that. And this is not a period of women's cricket where there were a lot of sixes. But with her wicket, it meant that Sri Lanka had their number 10 and 11 at the crease, the scores were tied, and there were 2 balls to come. England was using Georgia Elwes to bowl. She's more of a part-timer, but even then she had a bowling average of 26 in ODI. Facing was Delani Mandara, their specialist keeper in that game, who often batted higher but had been placed down the order, perhaps because she had a career strike rate of 49. And with 1 run to win, Mandara hit the first and last 6 of her ODI career. Sri Lanka had beaten the world champions 9 wickets down with the 6th from the last ball. I mean, that was absolutely incredible. And it kept going. Sri Lanka actually beat India later in that World Cup as well. They qualified for the next round, and that's when they started to struggle a little bit more. Perhaps then because teams had actually seen some of them. But there is a reason why this team that had never really been that successful in the women's game had suddenly got a lot better. A couple of years before the World Cup, there'd been a move in Sri Lanka to make the women's team more professional, but they actually didn't want to spend any money on them. So what they did is they encouraged them all to take up positions within the armed forces. It's largely ceremonial. They weren't out there actually operating guns or anything. But what it did allow them to do was spend a lot more time practicing and getting better at cricket. And there was a sudden boom in Sri Lankan women's cricket at that time. That was incredible for the time, and even though it was completely professional, it was certainly a step in the right direction. The problem is that since then, women's cricket has actually changed massively. First through England's professionalism, and then Australia's. And we've had, booms with West Indies and South Africa and India all getting a lot better, not to mention legends like Susie Bates and now Amelia Kerr in New Zealand. In fact, for Susie Bates, there probably should be a statue outside of every New Zealand ground greeting you as you come in. Oh, and Sana Mir in Pakistan improved their team out of sight. And she also has her own fragrance. So, how good you have to be at cricket to get your own fragrance? Pretty good. And if you think about a team like South Africa, they could nearly fill up a franchise 11. They have so many players around, and they were easy beats before. And now their players are getting a bit more support at home, but they're also improving because they're playing in all these overseas leagues. That's great for women's cricket. Sadly, Sri Lanka hasn't joined in on any of it. And I knew they were struggling, but it wasn't really till I did the numbers on the Australian team I realised how bad the Sri Lankan team had actually fallen. Since the last World Cup, they have 1 win. I mean, I knew it had been bad. I mean, it's beyond bad, isn't it? Terrible's not horrific? I don't know the right word. The last one day that the Sri Lankan women won was in 2018. And I have more bad news. The last time they played in ODI was 2019. During COVID, with the World Cup due, Sri Lanka cricket just basically abandoned their women's team entirely. And if that was bad, it got a lot worse when the World Cup qualifying tournament they were playing in was cancelled altogether. Also, the Women's World Cup is only 8 teams, and the last 3 spots were decided on ODI rankings. Do you remember when I said Sri Lanka had won a single game since the last World Cup and hadn't played one since 2019? We're going to be shocked to know that predictably their ranking is pretty terrible from the 5 matches they have played. They are well below Pakistan at 8 and just under Ireland at 9. And those 5 games that they played, 3 of those were against Australia. They tried to qualify for a World Cup by playing the best team in the world 3 times and only 2 other games. So the Sri Lankan women's team, through COVID, a lack of professionalism, support of their own board, and a comically small World Cup, will not be playing in this edition. Oh, and you have to include their own bad form. And they have been actually really bad. However, if we go back to the rankings, I want to show you something else. See how high Bangladesh is. Their women have been killing it recently, winning 50% of their matches and kicking ass. They deserve to be in the World Cup. In fact, since the last edition of the World Cup, the Bangladeshi women are 6-6. Now, 3 of those wins are against Zimbabwe, but they have still beaten Pakistan 3 times. It's fair to say that Sri Lanka's schedule has just been a lot tougher than Bangladesh's since that last World Cup. They've played 3 games against the West Indies, Pakistan, India, South Africa, England, and Australia. And their only win was against India when Atapattu played another one of her blinders. In fact, as it currently stands since the last World Cup, she has made 22.6 of her team's runs. The next best is 8.7. Atapattu is a star. She played in whatever they called that women's IPL exhibition thing, and she's also been a regular in the Big Bash as well. She's just clearly a top-level player. She also has the 3rd most wickets since the last World Cup. Not that she's actually a good bowler. In fact, she's definitely not. But then no Sri Lankans have been. As a team, they average 38 runs per wicket, while being the only major team that go up more than 5 runs and over. This is actually why I noticed them in the first place when I was doing the video on the Australian team, because Sri Lanka have just been so incredibly awful. And it's not just this cycle of the World Cup. Since that incredible 2013 campaign, they've won 7 of their last 63 ODIs. And in T20 cricket, they're marginally better. They've won 22 of 54. Since then, the kind of coaching and captaincy carousel that their men often get hit with has happened to them. But far worse things have happened, like when some officials were accused of asking for sexual favors for selection. No charges were laid, but 3 people did lose their job. I've mostly followed this from an international standpoint, but Estelle Vasudevan has written a great feature on just how bad things have been for domestic Sri Lankan women's cricket. I mean, there is a reason that they are not getting better, right? There is so little money and support for this particular team. I mean, since that last World Cup, the Sri Lankan women in all formats have played 54 matches. The men have played 173. And of course you might be thinking that COVID has played a role in this. So let's just look at the 2 since the start of 2020, where the men have played 66 times and the women have played 8. It's incredible the way that COVID only seemed to affect Sri Lankan women cricketers and not the men. Through the professionalism of women's cricket, the ICC, and their own board, they've just been left behind. Now, obviously their performances haven't helped, but being that they have been successful at a World Cup before, you would have to say that the problem isn't talent here, it's clearly something else. Recently, they tried to fix their problems by appointing Hassan Tilakaratne as their coach. I don't think it's a coach situation or even a captain situation. It feels like it's the system. Because either you believe that the 2013 World Cup and pretty much everything that Chamara has done is a huge fluke, or something is very wrong with how the Sri Lankans have been running their women's cricket team. And I think it's fair to say that they've given us one of the great World Cup upsets of all time. And at the very least, they deserve better treatment than this.